Okay, so before I get started, if you don't have any paper with you, I'd like you to get a blank piece of paper and you can actually just fold it in half and fold it in half again, and then make 4 boxes within each of those boxes. It'll just an easy way for you to organize some notes that we're going to take today about the Cold War ending and some things that happened after the Cold War ended. So this chapter actually covered a really large time period. So I will try to get through everything. I'm going to combine some different PowerPoints that I had and go back and forth. But as far as the Cold War ending, we're going to go ahead and recap a little bit. I'll give you a minute to do this, but we're going to recap the causes, who was involved, and then the ending, what were some of the effects after. So take a minute and get yourself set up. If you have a different way you want to set this up, go ahead and take notes however make best sense to you. Okay, so let's talk about the Cold War again. I'm sorry, I'm gonna show you something else really quickly. I can't get my computer screen to change. I'm sorry. So back when the Cold War was in full swing, we talked about this happening after the end of World War II, and that the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers. And then the two embarked on a Cold War. Okay, so you've got some more people now. So let me go back to my other one, show you what you're going to need to draw on your paper. So if you're just joining, I'd like you to get a piece of paper and do something similar to this to help organize the notes today. I'm going to quickly go back and recap a little bit about the Cold War and then the Cold War ending. But I'm going to go back in time before we get to this. I just want you to get this ready. And then now I'm going to pop over to something else to recap something that I did not talk about last week. Okay. I got it. All these buttons to push. All right. So we know that the Cold War, the main point that you think about when you think of the Cold War was the buildup of nuclear arms and the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. That's why it's called a race. And it was this massive buildup of weapons. So it began when the Soviet Union built their H-bomb in 1953. And eventually, both countries developed ICBMs, which were missiles. They were nuclear missiles that you could launch from around the world. So you did not have to have a plane flying. They could be launched and aimed at anywhere in the world. So it was a very kind of scary, uncertain time. But it didn't actually stop here. So this is just a chart of the total number of warheads that were owned by specific countries. So you can see here that the Soviet Union had even more than we did, but this was considered a race to see who could have the most. Now, these were weapons that would cause massive, irreversible destruction. So the thought was that if war broke out, the world was going to be completely destroyed. So if you look at this little diagram here of all the paths that missiles could take, the threat of being able to destroy the world was supposed to be the deterrent from destroying the world. So that's the mindset of what the nuclear arms race was all about. If we can completely destroy everything, you probably don't want to mess with us because you don't want that to happen. All right, so this is the theory of MAD. Okay, sorry. This didn't just stop with nuclear weapons here on Earth. It actually turned into a space race, again, called a race because it was a competition. They were just competing with technology in general. So the battle was to prove who had the most technology and who could get to space first. And this really develops over time into who could use space for weapons and who could use space technology to intercept and prevent weapons. So it really began to develop when Russia launched Sputnik. Sputnik was the world's first satellite. So I would say, even though this isn't on that chart that I had you draw, and I don't have a note sheet for today because I kind of, I put these PowerPoints together and I don't know, I couldn't get them all together in one thing and get notes. But anyway, I do want you to know, if you're recording, writing this down, whatever, that Sputnik is the world's first satellite. It was launched by the Soviet Union. So rockets that launch satellites are the same rockets that they can use to launch missiles. So of course, this technology is something that the US has to quickly become an equal in. So they are determined that they're going to prove they have the technology to go into space. So I remember last week briefly mentioning this is the birth of NASA. It actually started as NACA and eventually evolved into NASA. So it was President Kennedy that really pushed this technology of putting a man on the moon. So in 1969, July 20th, Neil Armstrong is the first man to step foot on the moon. Ends the space race, kind of, sort of. Okay. So let me pick my next one. Where am I? This one. Okay. Sure. Okay, so back to my one that I have you draw this box. So let's talk about, how does all of this end? Well, I just want you to wrap your head around this for a minute of the picture I showed you of the number of nuclear warheads owned by the United States and by the Soviet Union. And just think about the massive amount of money it took to build up those weapons. So the Soviets spent a ton of money fighting to support the communist cause. So when we last left communism, it was spreading to about 1/3 of the globe. That took a lot of money. So in order to support the communist cause and to put down revolts in places like Hungary and Afghanistan. So I think one of your questions was, what escalated the war in 1979? Well, that would have been because the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. It was a hugely unpopular war around the world, cost them a massive amount of money. They were trying to support a small communist takeover of the country and take down Islam. Enormous amounts of money were spent on the arms and space race, and the USSR and the United States just constantly threw money into projects to try to outdo each other in both space and the arms race. And then, of course, the Soviet Union also has the cost of all of these military ventures they are supporting around the world to support communism. So in 1986, we've moved ahead to the Reagan presidency by now, but I'm going to go back and touch on this because this one is not all inclusive for me, but I do want to go back and hit some other things. But beginning in 1986, the Soviet Union began to cut funding to what's referred to as the satellite states. Those are all of the countries that were now encompassed under the control of communism. Some of them were part of the Soviet Union. Some of them were behind the Iron Curtain and had puppet governments installed by the Soviet Union. And they were funded by the Soviet Union. But that money is running out. So there was Margaret Thatcher of the United Kingdom made this statement one time that the thing about socialism is that eventually you're going to run out of everybody else's money. And that's basically what's happening here in the Soviet Union. They're taking everybody's money because they have taken over private ownership of the entire country, but they're running out of everybody else's money. So they began to experience a recession, which was similar to the Great Depression in the United States. It's simply they're running out of money. The value of their money is decreasing on the world stage. So there was a new leader that came into the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. And he came in at a time when the Soviet Union is really struggling economically. So he actually introduces two new concepts called glasnost and perestroika. So these are very bold. And I will tell you, by the end of Mikhail Gorbachev's career, he apparently got sick and just disappeared off of the political stage. But for a time, he really took over reforming the Soviet Union. So glasnost is Russia for publicity or openness, meaning that we are going to switch from being a closed off communist country and we're going to open up and have transparency to the world. So he wanted to allow more free speech and more freedom of the press. So this is actually popular with most Russian people, but not necessarily for all of the rich oligarchs that are the ones who got wealthy through communism. He also had a policy of perestroika. And so perestroika is the Russian word, and I'm probably not saying it correctly, but that's just how I remember it being pronounced. It just means restructuring. And it was a movement of reform for the Soviet Union to switch back to some private ownership of businesses. Because see, they're running out of money and the government is too stretched and too big to make businesses profitable. So the thought is, hey, let's turn some of these larger industries that could make money back over to private ownership so that the people who can get rich will be motivated to increase profits and we can have some more money flowing back into the country. So within a few years, many of the countries under the Soviet Union had gone totally broke. Communism did not work. You could not induce enough motivation for people to work hard and to be productive if you're going to take everything that is earned and redistribute it. It just didn't work. And so by 1991, being bankrupt, the Soviet Union was completely dissolved. So Mikhail Gorbachev was the leader from the Soviet Union from 1985 to 1991. So when we're talking about the Cold War, he was known for the beginner of the liberalization in the USSR. So because of those policies of glasnost and perestroika, he was seen as the Russian leader who pushed the country towards some democracy and capitalism. Very small steps. The president of the United States at this time was Ronald Reagan. He was president from 1981 to 1989. So in terms of the Cold War, so these are your people in your box where I said there's people that are the prominent figures of the Cold War. So he was known as the president who developed a working relationship with Gorbachev to improve those Cold War relations. They were known as the SALT talks. So I can't remember what SALT stands for, but I'm going to tell you because I have a phone and it's very quick. So part of these negotiations and these talks were for a very strategic destruction of a certain number of nuclear warheads. Okay, I can't type and talk at the same time. I spell everything wrong. I can't believe I didn't remember this. So SALT stands for the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. And it was meant to not only destroy a certain number or to disarm them. So they didn't like go and crush them or whatever. They basically disarmed them where they weren't nuclear capable. But it also limited manufacturing of any new weapons. He is also the president that gave the famous speech in Berlin calling for the destruction of the Berlin Wall, which we talked about last week, the wall that divided the capital city of Germany into two parts. I could give you a little more on that if we have some time. Okay, after Ronald Reagan, the next president was George H.W. Bush. So he's the president that was credited for continuing to improve relations with the Soviets as they transitioned to the Russian Federation. So this is a very difficult time for all of those countries that were a part of the Soviet Union. They had to completely rebuild their government, their whole infrastructure, and their whole economy. So that took a lot of assistance from the countries from the West. And so basically, this began on a large scale during the presidency of George H.W. Bush. Okay, some of the details, because this is just an overview, but I will always go back and give you some more details because we've got some other things to make sure we talk about. So we know communism was established in 1917. They pulled out of World War I, signed a treaty with Germany. They became the Soviet Union, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. That lasted about 75 years. Soviet is a term that refers to that common worker, because that's what this communism was based on, that proletariat would have equal rights to every other worker. Okay, the last figure we're going to talk about here is Boris Yeltsin. So as the Soviet Union collapsed and broke apart, Yeltsin became the first president elected by popular vote in the new country. So his election marks the beginning of a new era in Russia. It began the Russian Federation. So in 1987, President Reagan visited West Berlin and gave that famous speech where he makes this famous quote, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall." That was a prolific speech that was a metaphor for saying, take down the barriers that have divided the world between communism and democracy, and let's put that country back together. So you think about this too, as the wall is taken down, as Germany is reunified, that is also an enormous task. So one of the ways that it was easy for me to remember, and it's not even in this PowerPoint, but when I was learning this as a student, I'll never forget this. So the person that was given the task of rebuilding the economy of East and West Germany put back together, his last name was Kohl, like Kohl's department store. So maybe now you'll remember that. But talk about a huge task. He's taking the complete polar opposites of economic philosophies on East and West Germany, and he has to put them together and create an entirely new economy for one country. So in 1980 wall, I can't believe I just said 1989, the wall comes down. Many East German citizens were already escaping the communist world by going to Austria through Hungary, because border fences had become less of a obstacle for them. Some of them were being taken down. There were many people who were killed trying to escape over the wall or sneak out of the eastern side. So as this began, and this little tiny picture up there is just a hint of like the massive amounts of people that would come out and would protest and would push to try to get out of the city to escape communists. Well, eventually the Berliners overwhelm the guards and they can cross over, and the wall comes down for good a few weeks later. It's just, they can't enforce it anymore. So this is known as the beginning of the end of communism. And so in late 80s, this says 89, it actually began a little bit before that, the Eastern Bloc, or the name, those countries that were controlled by the Soviet Union, began to revolt and want freedom. So we've talked about many times the effect that nationalism plays in countries wanting to divide and have different borders, because the ethnicities were not taken into account when borders were drawn. Well, it's also going to come into play here, and I'm going to touch on it again when we talk about Yugoslavia, but it's not on this PowerPoint. So there's a lot of circling back today, but the Eastern Bloc begins to fall in 1989. That's East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Bulgaria, and they all overthrow their communist governments relatively peacefully. Romania's revolution was more violent. I do remember as a teenager watching this on the news. What was his name? Ceausescu. He was actually assassinated when Romania revolted against communism. When this happens, the USSR completely dissolves and splits into 15 separate nations that are listed here. I'm not going to say them all. You can read them. So the bottom picture is just, you know, Yeltsin looking at the Soviet Union broken into chunks. So the 6 Eastern Bloc nations. So let me just make sure you understand the difference. These countries were part of the Soviet Union. Okay. When the Soviet Union existed, They weren't considered independent nations. Just to the west of them, in the area known as the Eastern Bloc, where there was East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania, those countries were considered the Eastern Bloc nations. They also abandoned communism. All right, so I think that I got this. Okay. So in the beginning, last week, when we talked about communism and that countries would fall to communism, there was a little movie of dominoes falling and that there was the domino effect. Well, it's almost in reverse here. And there is a domino effect of the fall of communism. So in a few years, more countries will end communism. It's funny because it's not really the Asian nations that ever abandoned communism once they fell to communism. It is the European nations where communism started. Those are the ones who experienced the fall of communism. So for the first time in history, Russia becomes a democracy. So today, Russia is not considered a communist country. They are a socialist democracy. For centuries, though, Russia was ruled by the czars, and after the 1917 revolution, it became a communist dictatorship. It wasn't until 1991 that Russia rejoined the world community as a democracy. So it's funny because this PowerPoint was clearly created before everything that's going on with Russia today. And Russia does not appear like a democracy. But in terms of it being defined, it has a president, it has a governing body, and there are elections. It just doesn't have the same amount of freedom and the boundaries that we have of what we know as democracy. So there's only 5 communist nations that remain: Laos, Cuba, China, Vietnam, and North Korea. Like I said, it's kind of interesting that where communists began and it's where communist falls, but where it spread to, many of these countries remain. And so the biggest concern of the remaining communist nation in the world at this time for the United States is actually Cuba. This is world history, so we don't focus on it all too much, but it is Cuba that is the closest. My dogs always do crazy things here. The closest to the United States. So it is the country that has the possibility of offering the greatest threat of invasion to the United States. All right, so this is just kind of things that you should have in each box. And I am going to go back and hit some details, which I know is probably not your favorite thing, but there's so much more that was in this chapter. So I'm going to recap here. Where am I? There we go. Right. I'm sharing. I am sharing. So I'm so challenged. All right. So I mentioned the invasion of Afghanistan. So this was in your book. It's one of the questions if you haven't finished all of your homework yet. It was in 1979. It came between this period of détente. So, I didn't even talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. When Kennedy was president during the space race, talking about Cuba, Russia put nuclear weapons, or the Soviet Union put nuclear weapons on Cuba facing the United States. Kennedy orders an invasion of Cuba. It ends up being scrapped at the last minute, and Russia ends up removing those missiles. Then for a time, there is a period between those two superpowers that it pretty much calms down, and there's not a lot going on. But in 1979, when the USSR invades Afghanistan, they're trying to prevent the little unpopular communist government from being overthrown by Osama bin Laden. So kind of an interesting thing when you think about, wonder what would have happened in the history of the United States if he had been overthrown and there was communism there. But it was a very unpopular war around the world. It was unprovoked, basically, just like their invasion of the Ukraine today. It was unprovoked, and it caused President Reagan to back out of many of those SALT talks and his negotiations with them. Okay. It was all of this unrest and this exorbitant spending that even before communism fell, it was the only reason that Mikhail Gorbachev was able to come into the country and have any kinds of reforms at all. So I'm not going to go over too much here because I've already said it. But I do want to point out one thing to you, because I've lived in this era. But if you look at Mikhail Gorbachev and the picture of him on the left at the top, you can see he has that birthmark on the top of his head in the front. And so it was a big thing in the 80s of people wondering if that was the mark of the beast, if he was the Antichrist. And so that was kind of a big deal back then. So just want to point that out. But these are just the same things. I'm reiterating, gone back, the SALT treaties, the perestroika, and the glasnost. Okay. When this happens, there's some pro-democracy movements in Eastern Europe. And your book mentions quite a few of these. So I'll try to give them to you in a succinct form here. Communism basically caused poverty, food shortages, lack of innovation, a lot of corruption. And so there was this need for economic recovery and growth and prosperity in all of those nations that are going to be capitalist nations. And the Soviet Union is just losing control. So the first satellite nation, this is one of your questions, this person's name, that breaks free. Remember, they're not part of the Soviet Union. They're part of the Eastern Bloc. The first one to break free is Poland. The leader of Poland is this guy, Lech Walesa. Sorry if I pronounced his name wrong. He had a pro-democracy party called the Solidarity Party, and he won control of Poland's government. Gorbachev, with his new policies, actually does no actions on this, and he does nothing to reinstall communist rule. So in November, same year, this is going on at the same time as all of those mobs in Berlin. Okay, so without the support of the USSR communism, these nations began to turn away from their entire economic system and look towards NATO. I wanted to bring that up because if you watch the news or follow the Ukraine war at all, they want to join NATO. That's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That's what all of these nations, when they turn from communism, turn to becoming partners with NATO. Just some pictures. if you're interested, there's actually really cool videos on YouTube of the wall coming down and famous speeches there. You know, it's a pretty huge turning point in the world, such a change in just the landscape of the world, politically and economically. Okay, so in 1991, we now have 15 multicultural republics that were part of the Soviet Union that now are going to become nations. So there are 3 that are referred to as the Baltic states. Those are the first ones that break free. That's Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. So soon after the Soviet republics declared their independence, all the other nations began to do the same. It lists them again. They all regained their independence by 1991. I'm not going to go over all that. So there was one other thing in your book talked about, is this was Yugoslavia. I mentioned it with our first overview PowerPoint at the end, that this was one of the domino nations, Yugoslavia and Albania, that there is also a fall of communism. So it's in the Balkan region of Southeast Europe, and it is home to a wide variety of ethnicities and religions. You may have heard of some of these, the Croatians, the Slav, that's not how I would spell that, the Serbians, the Albanians, the Macedonians, the Hungarians, and the Montenegrins. And you can look here, there's also a variety of religions. So much like Russia and the Soviet Union. So if you think of all the countries that the Soviet Union encompassed, your brain always thinks of Russia as that being the country that had control. That was the country that took over and brought all these others in. Well, in Yugoslavia, it was the Serbs who were like the Russians. They wanted to have the majority of the control. So as the oppressive government collapsed, the nationalist groups want to break off and declare independence. Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Macedonia all declare independence in 1994. So 3 years later, now we have another change in the map. So yeah, if you're a geography student at this time, you got to keep relearning things because it kept changing. People who were born in Yugoslavia and had a Yugoslavian birth certificate might not even exist anymore because the country is literally breaking apart. The newly elected Serbian president was Milošević. He wants to keep the remainder of Yugoslavia united, but there's a region of Kosovo that is trying to declare independence. In his attempt to try to keep a little bit of Yugoslavia together, he sends military forces into Kosovo. So here you go. This is the breakup. You can see the location here, the countries that are around it. Okay. So this is a time that was known as the Bosnian Genocide. So Milošević and the Serbian-led government in Yugoslavia blame the Albanian Muslims. So this is, again, we've got a type of a rising government trying to take down the rise of a Muslim government. So when we talk about different eras of history and the things that are the biggest issues at a time, you can start to see a flow here that it will turn from communism to terrorism. And so the Albanian Muslims are blamed for instigating the rebellion. And so they began this policy of what is referred to as ethnic cleansing against the Muslim population in Kosovo. So Muslims living in Kosovo had to either leave their homes and get out, or they had to face death at the hand of the army. So around that same time, there's a new nation, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the violence erupts between the two largest ethnic groups there as well. The Bosnian Christians, who are mostly Serbs, wish to remove the Muslim populations from Bosnia. So Yugoslavia also supports the Bosnian Serbs and beginning a policy of ethnic cleansing there as well. So at this time, we have not had a problem in the world with the rise of Muslim governments. There is no terrorism and there is no threat of Muslim governments at this time. At this time, the threat to peace is caused by the Christian ethnic groups that want to kill all of the Muslim population. So NATO supports the Muslim population. So the strikes are able, they send in military strikes and they're able to eventually end the genocide, but not before millions have been killed or turned into refugees. So this causes the final ripping apart of Yugoslavia, which does not exist as a country anymore. Milosevic is prosecuted as a war criminal for all of this genocide. So there are people today, my mom has a friend who was born in Yugoslavia. Her birth certificate says that, but you know, she no longer has a country that she could say she was born in. It's no longer a country. Okay, so Yeltsin, the last person we put in our little box there of people for the end of the Cold War, he comes into power when Mikhail Gorbachev resigns in 1991 after an attempted overthrow. Mikhail Gorbachev just disappears off of the world scene because of a mysterious illness. Boris Yeltsin is elected. He has more economic reforms, but they don't work. They lead to serious problems. And Russia is really struggling as they're trying to make this conversion to free market capitalism. So that is an enormous task of privatization of government-owned industry. So he has a policy or a set of policies that were known as shock therapy. These led to massive food shortages, inflation, crime, corruption. And so after 75 years of living with an economy based on communism, Russians really aren't up to par and up to date and able to compete in free market communism. And so a lot of Russians do think maybe we should return to communists. So Yeltsin is also struggling to rein in all of this nuclear weapon and materials that were still in possession of all of those satellite countries. So if you think about that, they were all part of his country. And so when they break apart and get their independence, how are you going to get back your nuclear weapons? They were all strategically placed in many different areas that were now independent countries. So modern day Russia, wow, he looks young here. Vladimir Putin wins the election in 1999. Clearly, they don't have a term links that they're bound to in Russia because he is still the leader. He promises to restore Russian pride, and he wants to bring Russia back to being a world power. So he does improve the economy when he comes into power in 1999. Political rights and freedoms, though, are again limited. So he is a dictator, but he casts to the world that this is a democratic nation with elections. Even today, it is a constant thing in the news how Russia interferes with elections, including the election in the United States. I spoke to somebody yesterday completely on a different topic that her husband works for the National Guard in cybersecurity, and he is now stationed in Poland. And one of the most difficult things right now is to stop the hacking of the Russian government into other countries' databases. They are extremely good at rigging things and hacking into computer systems. So he has this he's a dictator. I'm just going to say that. Some people see him as strong, that he stabilized Russia and brought them and back up in the world dominance and has improved their economy. So when they first invaded Ukraine, they interviewed several people, like famous Russian athletes that play on teams outside of the country, and they would try to get these people to say something negative about Vladimir Putin. But most of them will say something like, well, I don't believe in war, but he is my president. So he has commanded this incredible sense of loyalty. So even though communism has broken down, they are still a socialist democracy that he has an incredible amount of control. Okay. Really quickly, because these were in your questions, so I want to make sure that I give you the correct answers to some things. So the reunification of Germany took place in 1991, the lifting of that Iron Curtain. So the former Warsaw Pact. So if you think back, when NATO was created, the response to that was the Warsaw Pact, which is a military alliance. Most of Europe is now allied together for a greater collective security. That's why Ukraine wants to join. Russia continues to oppose the existence of NATO because they say it's a threat to national security. So there is the creation of the European Union. I think your question is something like how many nations existed. I don't remember, but it's like when it's created, there's 25 nations, I think. I don't remember exactly what the question was. The rising economic power of China, along with NATO, encourages the formation of the European Union. It's referred to as the EU. They want to unify their economies together, remove trade barriers, and adopt a common currency. So it's almost like the United States. The states are the countries. They have no barriers of trade between state to state, and they use the same money, the euro. So Europe is now one large free trade zone. So there's a true free market. Trade barriers such as tariffs are illegal. The same money. So when you cross the border, you don't have to go exchange your money. And it gives a lot of resources in variety and quantity that are available because there is regional cooperation. Thinking of what natural resources are in one country are easily available to other countries now. It's one of the world's largest global economies. However, The UK has since pulled out. That is a recent history thing. So I might get to that in the very last lesson. Okay, I don't have time to go over all of this, but there's one more quick thing that I want to show you. I have a few minutes, so I'm going to take them and I'm going to show you a couple more quick things, because it really did go way ahead into different presidencies in the United States. So I mentioned him before. George H.W. Bush came after Reagan. Okay. I'm only going to connect the dots here on some things. That's all I'm doing, just to give you this big overview and connecting some time periods. This is the president and the time when Lech Walesa led Solidarity in Poland. So even though Reagan is the one who calls for the tearing down of the wall in Berlin, it is during the Bush presidency that the two Germanys reunite and the Cold War officially ends. So here you go. Got people climbing over the wall. It is during his presidency that he spends the most time of the presidency of Boris Yeltsin. So Gorbachev in prison, gets sick, falls away, and the USSR is separated. We will get to this next week, so I'm not going to cover that here. These two things. One other president that your book, I think it might have even gone farther now that I'm thinking about it, but I'm not going to, is Clinton. So the next president of the United States was Bill Clinton. On the world stage, that would be the time of Kosovo, when communist Yugoslavia collapsed and broke into the ethnic factions, and the Slavs in Bosnia began to commit genocide. The U.S. sends troops in 1993. So all I'm doing here, guys, is just connecting this world history to our U.S. history. It was also a time that peace accords between the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO, and Israel began. This is called the 1993 Peace Accords. Peace only lasts about 5 years here, but you can see here we have the leader of the PLO. His name is Yasser Arafat. The leader of Israel is Benjamin Netanyahu. Then there's King Hussein I, and there's Bill Clinton. The PLO at this time actually finally recognizes Israel's right to exist. Again, just connecting all this. So I think that's all whoops, I hit the wrong button. So remember how Russia wanted to invade Afghanistan and prevent Osama bin Laden from coming into power, and the world just looked on that very poorly, escalated the Cold War. Well, now in the 1990s, Osama bin Laden is now a world leader and organizes attacks against the US. And we will talk more about this, but I just wanted to link it here because it was the Cold War where we first see his appearance, and the world supports him in that particular instance, because at that time, the world threat was communism and the Cold War, and he's not a threat yet. So the fact that the world is fighting communism and the Cold War and looks away from this will lead us to the next era where there is a rise of terrorism that begins right here. All right, so I'm going to finish for the day. I hope that helps you understand how the Cold War ends and will turn the world stage to a new problem. And I hope that that really helps you answer some of the questions on your homework. So I hope you guys have a great weekend, and I will see you guys next week. Bye, everyone.
Bye.